couple things before we dive into the text for today. I'm going to share the screen, and this is where we are for today. You have your reading responses right there. I gave you 3 readings. This is the big one here, free to choose, 2 chapters from Milton Friedman's book. Also that little article, The Social Responsibility of Business is Increased Profits. Talk about that shortly. I gave an additional reading. This was not required, just recommended, about Scott Pruitt and the EPA. Former head of the EPA, kind of illustrates. You didn't put sugar in it? Oh, okay. Hi, my coffee has arrived. Sorry, guys. I needs to caffeinate. It's been a long day. Let's see what else here. Scott Pruitt, former head of the EPA under Donald Trump, kind of illustrates exactly the dangers that Milton Friedman is talking about in chapter 7 today. So if you have time, I recommend reading it. It's from Mother Jones. It's from a magazine. So it's short and it reads very well. And it's, I think, extremely interesting. Of course, troubling, but thank God he's gone now, as is Donald Trump. Next week, I'm going to have you all read a rather famous article in the last 5 years called The Case for Reparations by Ta-Nehisi Coates. Ta-Nehisi Coates is a contemporary author. He's not generally someone who writes on economic issues, but I mean, he's more of a social critic. But this is a great essay about the economic plight of African Americans in America and the market, how the market was abused to punish them. Again, echoing critiques of Milton Friedman. And then an article supplementing that. I think this might be from, I forget where that's from, how African Americans have been locked out of home ownership. And then your reading responses due. Okay. Let's see here. I need more sugar. Excuse me. All right. This is what I wanted to talk to you about as well. 2 weeks from today, you have a paper due, your first paper. So I'm going to give you plenty of time to look at these. I'm going to go over them with you. I've given you 2 things here. I have a footnoting and style sheet. I'll go over that with you next week. Some style points, also some pointers for how I would like you to, how you should be footnoting. For those of you in the know, I'm asking you all, I will ask you all to do what is called Chicago style footnoting your references. In other words, you will not be doing in-text citations of quotes. You will be putting your references in the footer of the page. That's why they're called a footnote. More on that next week. Let me take a look at these paper directions here, okay? So you're to write a paper of 4 to 5 pages in length on one of the following topics. Please write your paper in standard formatting. I'm not really that anal. I just don't want you messing around. These papers are due in class on February 24th. Please submit them as a PDF on Canvas. I'll deduct and you'll have that option on this prompt itself under student view. You have the option in the top right corner to submit it directly to Canvas as a PDF. And I'm going to deduct a third of a grade for each day that the papers are late. I have come up with a couple of topics about the readings we'll have done by that time. But if you have a topic of your own interest that you really want to study more closely or write about, I'm always open. I'm all ears, but I would like to hear about it. I don't like to be surprised about that. Feel free to talk to me at any time that you're writing these papers. If you want to, make arrange a conference or whatever. The writing studio is up and running online. You can meet with tutors virtually. I believe some of them are across a variety of time zones. So you can schedule this website right here. Okay. Grading criteria, what I'm looking for in these papers. I am looking for four things. I'm looking for persuasive argumentation. For these first papers, as is indicated on your syllabus, these first papers are interpretive. I want to make sure that you're paying attention to the text, paying close attention, and understanding the author and reporting on his argument accurately and fairly. Okay. The next papers will be interpretive, where I ask you to engage critically with an author. But about persuasive argumentation, you're building a case, and in building a case, quotes can be helpful to build your case. There is a happy medium, though, right? It's a good idea to let me know that you are familiar with the text, you're paying attention to the author's words, but don't go overboard. Okay, I want to hear your voice as well. Second, make sure your position in the paper and all arguments and evidence you support it is expressed clearly. I need to see some clarity. Proofreaders can be helpful here. Correct grammar, that's a part of clarity. If your grammar is incorrect or there's spelling mistakes, your clarity will be undermined. And fourth, insightful comments and critiques. This is what separates good papers from the adequate, and great papers from adequate ones. Make your paper interesting and include insight beyond what was discussed in class. Footnoting. I want you to footnote quoted passages in your papers. If you're not sure what a footnote is or how to footnote, my handout on footnoting and style guidelines, which I'll go over next week, explains what that is. I've given an example of what a footnote in Chicago style would look like. It's this: author, title, translator. Don't forget the translator. And the translator goes here. He doesn't go where the author is. Max Weber is the only person who wrote that book. These guys merely translated it. Then the city, press, year, page, done. You only give all that information with the first footnote. For all subsequent footnotes from the same source, you may abbreviate. For example, Weber, Protestant Ethic, page 18. Attention, everybody. If you want to write about the Ta-Nehisi Coates article, I was negligent and I did not give, or maybe I didn't make entirely clear the source. So I have given you the full information. If you're writing the Ta-Nehisi Coates article, this is the footnote information you will need. It's from the web. It's from the Atlantic. Okay. And I have three topics here that I have written up, which I think are, they're the kinds of things I would like to hear you write about. You may have a choice, of course. One, Protestantism has an ambivalent relationship to material accumulation, according to Max Weber. Please describe it. How do Protestant sects like Lutheranism and Calvinism view material goods? Why do they drive capitalist energy all the same? How does hard, endless work become religious virtue? So you're invited to explain a key part of Weber's argument. Two, government is drawn into economic regulation on the best of intentions, Friedman notes. Unfortunately, said intervention often has unexpected drawbacks in the long term. What does he have in mind? Consider his examples in chapter 7. We'll talk about some of those today. Three, what are the various drawbacks in demanding reparations, as Ta-Nehisi Coates admits? Can any of the contemplated or proposed measures fully repair what has been lost? Why does Coates call for them anyway? What will the process of reparations do, which is valuable in his view? All right. Anybody have any questions at this time? Anybody? Questions? All right. Well, you may think on it and then get back to me when or if questions occur. Okay. All right. Good. So today we're going to talk about Milton Friedman. And he's really, it's really hard to underestimate his importance, um, not only in the field of economics and politics, especially 20th century politics. He has been a tremendous inspiration for modern conservatism in America. And but that said, you know, he still holds some surprises. Um, there are definitely aspects of modern conservatism that he would not approve of. But even while he has been an icon to conservatives, there are aspects of his thinking that might also be considered strikingly liberal. So we have to talk about that as well. Friedman dies in 2006. He taught at the University of Chicago, and he, even though he was an academic, he was very influential in economic policy in the U.S. government, especially under Ronald Reagan, when Ronald Reagan was president. And a lot of his ideas were realized and enacted, actually. And in many circles, some of his ideas are still in the process of working their way out. He was one of the first proponents of something called school choice, for example, where where you would give kids from poor neighborhoods, you would give them a voucher that they could then use to go to a different school or to a private school, right? And then schools could compete with each other for these students, right? This is an idea that he comes up with, which is still pretty controversial, but it's really endorsed by many conservatives, especially Betsy DeVos, who was the outgoing Secretary of Education under Donald Trump. She loved the idea of school choice. And, right. So his ideas, what's also interesting about Milton Friedman is that his thinking is very expansive. His ideas were not limited or restricted to the domain of economics. They made their way to all other fields because of his belief that the free market displayed such efficiency and was so fair, and the freedom was so perfect that every other that it's hard to say that any discipline could not benefit from by emulating free market competition, right? Even schools, right? Even something like public education can be energized by emulating the free market. That's an idea that is very much expounded by Friedman. The other idea that is popularized by Friedman is a very strong criticism of government. And this is probably where Ronald Reagan and Friedman overlap the most. When Ronald Reagan becomes president in 1980, actually, his campaign is basically the claim that government is not the solution, government is the problem. And that was a very new idea at the time, and it really took off. I think if you look at your text from Friedman today, you see where this idea comes from. So one other point about him, Milton Friedman. So he teaches at the University of Chicago, and the University of Chicago became a place where his kind of thinking was took root. And economists that were very sympathetic to him, they kind of flocked there. And so around Milton Friedman, you get this, it becomes like a nucleus of free market thinking, of a very specific reading or an interpretation of capitalism. So sometimes we refer to in common jargon, Friedman and his allies, or that that intellectual area. Oh gosh, my words are failing me here. This specific reading of capitalism and those people who sympathize with it, we call that the Chicago School for short. Before it was the Chicago School, it was the Austrian School. I'm not having you read any of those guys. There were a couple of very important predecessors to Friedman who pioneered free market ideology or laissez-faire capitalism. They were guys by the name of von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, and Joseph Schumpeter. I have taught von Mises and Hayek in this class before. Von Mises is borderline loony, and he has fans who adulate him. And then Hayek was more intellectual. He's more complex. I believe they emigrated to the States. I don't believe they emigrated because they were Jewish and were pressed by the Nazis, but I don't know exactly the circumstances under which they came here. But this school of thinking migrated to the States, took hold in the States, and then Chicago becomes its hotbed. Okay. All right, that's enough of a ramble. By the way, I also noticed that he wrote this book with, and he's the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, and he wrote this book with his wife, Rose. That's heartwarming, but I really know nothing about Rose, so don't ask me about Rose. Anybody have any questions or comments or observations? Okay. Anybody want to get the ball rolling here? Anything you'd like, anything in particular you guys want to start with Friedman? Anything strike your fancy, catch your eye, outrage you, warm your heart? Air.
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of Robert Reich, and
Yeah.
So he does like a lot of criticism of like the Chicago school and all that type of ideology. So it was just really contrary to me when I was seeing like all these beliefs that he was like had laid out, because it's very um like opaque, you know, it's just out there. Um I don't know. How can I start this? Let me look back at what I said in the reading responses.
Okay. Don't feel too much pressure here. Sean?
I forget exactly where he said this, but at some point he was talking about how in like a free market system, everyone any sort of interaction in the free market system is voluntary, and it necessarily benefits both parties, because otherwise both parties wouldn't engage in it. And I think that that's a little naive. I think that you could make an argument where it's technically true, but in a practical situation where, let's say, there are two employers in town, Big Barista and Corporate Coffee, and both of them are offering to pay me like $2 an hour. Technically, I can go work for either of them, and I'm technically benefiting by getting $2 an hour, but it's obviously not a sustainable or exactly fair price for my labor, but it's what I'm forced to acquiesce to in order to get any compensation for my labor.
Yeah. Good. Jessica.
Quick question about that. Why do you think that's still a benefit?
It's technically, I'm sort of thinking of it from what he would probably say, where it's technically a benefit because you are being compensated for your labor. But obviously, in terms
What's a
of
benefit?
So if in my example, if you're getting paid $2 an hour for your labor, that's technically a benefit
Okay.
under a free marketplace. But I'm forced to take $2 an hour. There's no way a company's not going to negotiate their wage up in a bidding war for me to be a barista for them. So if it's not if I don't consider it a fair price for my labor, my options are to starve or to accept something I don't agree with.
Or to do something else, right?
I was going under the assumption that Big Barista and corporate coffee are the only employers in town. Coffee is the only industry in town.
Oh, God. Okay, that's a very limited marketplace. But then Milton Friedman said that's not a real marketplace, right? That's just not an accurate marketplace, because if the price for baristas is depressed, then, you know, train to do something different, right? You are free to choose. You can choose where you want to go.
But that costs money.
To who? To you?
To train to get another skill, yeah, that costs money.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. Did you need to go to barista school to work at Starbucks?
Probably not.
I hear what you're saying, but the point is not necessarily. Not necessarily. Jesse?
I mean, this is a very convoluted hypothetical, but just to like draw it out a little bit further. So Big Barista and whatever corporate coffee are in town. They're offering to pay you $2 an hour, which, you know, at off top kind of sounds unreasonable. Like, are they employing anyone? Are there people working there that are making $2 an hour and like surviving? And like, what are they doing? Because that seems kind of a little insane. And maybe like no one is trying to work there for $2 an hour. So they're gonna, under Friedman's, you know, idea, they would compete with each other to like say, well, I'll pay $4. I just need someone to work here, you know? Mm-hmm. And someone would say $6 because 4 is still too low. Like, if there are people working there for $2 an hour, then that kind of, does that imply, this is, I guess, just a hypothetical question, does that imply that it's worth it to work there? Like, maybe I can work there for $2 an hour and groceries are only $2 a week, you know?
Yeah. That indicates something else about the market, right? That indicates something else about your immediate market. Yeah. Okay, Ella.
Kind of going back to like when you asked like why don't you learn another skill? Aside from like the financial cost of potentially having to learn another skill if you're going to college, there's like the opportunity cost of like not working while you try to acquire a new skill. Yeah. And if the only job that you currently have the skill for, the only job that's being offered is one that's underpaying, then if your choice is to be paid or not be paid, you're going to have to choose to be paid so that you can like eat.
Gotcha. Good. So while we're on this topic, I think we probably should accomplish something here. We're talking about a minimum wage right now. We're talking about wages. We're talking about really low wages. Right now, there is a big fight going on for a living wage. And many states and cities around the country have established this. And President Biden, I'm able to say those words. President Biden is going to say that you know, we should have a federal mandate for living wage, $15. What's the problem with that? Anybody know what the criticism is?
But isn't the problem that it causes like the overall expense of your items around you to basically increase, so that over a brief period of time, once everyone has this new minimum wage, the market will readjust itself and it will no longer be a living wage, but rather just a like more expensive but equally as shitty wage?
It would lead to inflation. That's one claim. Because more people have more cash to spend, and that will drive prices up. Right?
There's like the issue of small businesses no longer being able to afford to pay all their employees and having to cut the people they work for. So inevitably it's backwards because now less people have a job, but the people that do are getting paid more.
Yes. So I'm Christopher, are you referencing the other criticism is that it leads to unemployment?
Yes.
Okay. It makes unemployment worse. And how is that the case? Well, if workers cost $7 an hour and suddenly they're $15 an hour, employers are going to actually reduce the number of workers they have to try and keep their labor expenses steady as steady as possible. Right. So that's the other great fear. Chloe.
Particularly when Chris was talking, he framed it in like a small business mindset. And I've always like my own parents say that very often. And it's always like really confusing to me why it's okay for small businesses to pay people unlivable wages. Like I think we can get kind of misled by the idea of like, well, it's small business, so it's better than big business, which I mean, I guess is true, but is it ever okay to take someone's labor and not give them a livable wage in return is, I think, an important question.
Good, thank you. Jessica.
Yeah, I was also wondering the same thing and wanted to add on top of that every friend that I've had that has worked a small business, along with myself who has worked at a few small businesses, they have always paid more than corporate jobs that I or people around me have had. So that's mostly where my confusion comes from with the small business unemployment argument. And then I also wanted to ask about the it leading to inflation thing, because if I'm not mistaken, the entire time that the federal minimum wage has been $7.25 an hour, inflation has been happening, and people now just can't afford things, and they're still being paid the same that they were when things were a lot cheaper 10 years ago. So I was just wonder why raising it to a living wage of 15 an hour would make inflation go up even more, when isn't it just like now we can afford the things that are already being sold to us?
Two things. Inflation has been incredibly low. This has actually been the most confusing point for economists for the last 5 years. Nobody knows why inflation is so low. I have a theory. My theory is that the price of gas, which is kind of like the most important commodity out there, acts like an anchor and just brings everything down. Especially throughout the pandemic, the price of a barrel of oil plunged. And when gas is like $2.50 a gallon, all the things that rely on gas are also cheaper. So the food you buy that needs to be transported, right? The food that goes into agricultural production, the oil that goes into agricultural production, when that's all cheaper, then that's lower as well. But it's not entirely clear that's just my theory. The fact of the matter is that inflation has been incredibly low for the last 5 years. Your parents are probably the last generation that knows about this. I don't think in your lifetime we have had high inflation. In the 1980s, inflation was very high. And why is inflation a problem? It can be very socially unsettling. In many countries around the world, sometimes it even leads to war. When you, like in Venezuela right now, inflation is thousands %, which means that imagine going to the bakery and a loaf of bread is $1.50, and then you go back tomorrow and it's $2.75, and then you go back the next day and it's $10. That's the kind of cycle of inflation you do see at times that can be very, very destabilizing. In our own economy, which is relatively stable, if you start to see the price of, gallon the milk inch up, people get upset. Again, this is not something I think you would know, but in your lifetime, I think around 2008, I remember there was a giant spike in the price of gas, and gas went to $4 a gallon. You all seem pretty calm, but when that happened, people were fucking furious. Like, this was Civil War time, because Americans drive a lot, and suddenly a price of gas is double what I was paying normally. That's going to crowd out all my other expenditures, right? So that kind of price rise catches people's eyes. I like the point. I guess Daniel raised the point. I like the point about the living wage being this, like, how I'm in favor of it, but, I do understand the criticisms of it. And there's another problem we haven't gotten to yet, but I think one of the important criticisms of living wage is when everybody is risen up to $15 an hour, will this lead to a new reset of a new normal of prices that are still going to keep certain prices out of people's reach? You know what I mean? Like, will it just rise us to this new, we're here now, and then we get a living wage? I don't know. I mean, the key question is this. What we really need corporations to reorder what they spend their money on, right? As we'll see when we get to Thomas Piketty, a lot of money goes to the salaries of executives. Well, why don't we take from that and rearrange that to make a more fair payday? I'm kind of meandering. Air, you go for it.
Yeah, so I was gonna ask, does in part of the inflation being so low caused by like the stagnation of the median wage being like stuck at 50K for like the past like 30 years?
That's a very good point. That's an excellent point.
Robert Reich writes a lot about it and speaks on point about how like the median wage hasn't changed at all, and therefore thereby like this entire like economic downfall has been caused by like corporate greed by like the 1%.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know.
think that's very interesting. Stagnating wages. That is something that Piketty as well. Robert Reich is going to be a big ally of Piketty. That stagnating wages is another reason that inflation has been laggard. The point that all economists agree on, however, is that some inflation is not a bad thing. I think they're like the normal forecast is 3% a year. There should be 3% inflation a year. Right now we have about 2%. So it's strange. And the reason it's also strange is because the US government is literally injecting cash into the marketplace. First, everybody was given a $600 check. Next month, Biden is giving people a check for $1,400. When you have all this money out there in the marketplace bidding up prices, that's inflation. Or now I'm going to give you Ronald Reagan's definition of inflation, which is too many dollars chasing too few goods. Yeah, there you go. That's the only time I will ever quote Ronald Reagan. But this is what is so doubly mysterious to economists right now about why inflation is low. There's so much government infusion, and that's just those are the direct payments. The way that a government can indirectly stimulate the economy is through something called interest rates, specifically by lowering them. You all know what interest rates are. If you have like a credit card, you all you have interest rates on your college debt, right? The interest rates fluctuate But the very baseline for interest rate is set by the federal government itself. And that's the rate at which the federal government lends money to banks, right? A little bit of learning time for everybody. The Federal Reserve, founded by Mr. Hamilton, go watch the musical, is the national bank of the United States, responsible for printing your dollars. When you open your wallet, pull out your last remaining dollar, there's a little circle on there. It says printed by the Federal Reserve of, I don't know, Atlanta, Dallas, Boston, blah, blah. The Federal Reserve is responsible for printing money and setting interest rates. It's also called the lender of last resort. Here's what that means. The Federal Reserve is essentially the backup to all commercial banks in the country. Because you have to understand that banking is kind of a precarious business. And here's how it's precarious. This is the business model of a bank. They take your deposits and then they lend out to people, to businesses, home buyers. Here's the point. They always lend more than what they have in the deposits. So, God forbid everybody goes and takes out their deposits at the same time. Anybody know what that's called? That's called a run on the bank. This is essentially what happened in 2008 and in the Great Depression. Everybody went to get their cash out of the banks, and banks crash when that happens. So the Federal Reserve was created by FDR in the 1930s. Actually, it was before that. I'm sorry, into the 1800s, as a lender of last resort. The bank can always go and get money from the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve lends to banks at a very cheap rate, something like 1.5%, let's say. That becomes the benchmark for all other interest rates throughout the economy. Where do you see interest rates? You see them on your credit card. You see them on your home loans, on mortgages. You see them on car loans. In other words, if interest rates are low, people will be inclined to buy and spend money. And when people spend money, that sparks inflation. Therefore, the most reliable way for a government to slow inflation is to raise interest rates. In the 1980s, when Reagan comes into office, interest rates were inflation was incredibly high. I don't know how high. His head of the Federal Reserve, by a guy by the name of, can't remember, tall dude, Paul something. He just died recently. He raised interest rates to 18%. That is outrageous. I didn't look at the benchmark for today, but it's very, very low. I don't pay attention to the rates that are posed by the Federal Reserve. You can see this in the Wall Street Journal every day. As an ordinary suburban American, where I follow these is through mortgage rates for houses. And I can tell you right now that mortgage rates for houses are pathetically low. And that's actually why the housing market is booming right now. I'm sure your parents have an opinion on this.
We're actually looking at getting a house, and we don't know whether, like, because everything is so crazy right now with the housing market, like whether we should wait a year or like seize opportunities that are probably around because stuff is so hot.
Yeah, right now, my cousin is looking to buy a house, and as soon as he looks at a house, there are 5 bids on the house already. Right now, I forget what he said, but I think he is being offered interest rates on the order of 3%. Compare that to what they were in 1980, 18%. Those are the interest rates that are imposed at that point. So this is just my way of saying, you know, this is why the inflation question is so much more troublesome. By the way, interest rates have been this low since the recession of 2008, because the way that governments around the whole world sought to get out of that recession was to lower interest rates to increase demand. So they get people spending money, right? Because when people spend money, then jobs get created, people get back to work. Okay. So the question is, we've had low interest rates for 15 years now, well, 13 years now, and inflation has still been pitifully low. Very strange state of affairs.
This is like kind of off topic, but a little bit earlier. So like right now, there's like what is it, like the national change shortage? Is that because of like some type of run of the bank like thing with COVID, or is that a different issue unrelated?
Change? You mean like coins?
Yeah, is that like
I have no idea. I never heard of it.
Oh, like all around, you always see like people asking to use exact change and things like that. And I was curious if there was something for that, or if that's just something that like is like made up right now, because I couldn't like see anything like why
Yeah.
current, but it seems like since COVID, there's been like some type of movement for exact change or something.
Huh. Dude, I'm stumped. I have to look this up. I don't know. Hang on, I'm typing something in the chat here. I want to this is a definition I want you all to have. I'm putting in the chat the definition of a recession. A recession, by definition, is a cratering of demand for whatever reason. And when consumer demand craters, then jobs dry up. People are put out of work. So governments look at a recession. How do they get out of a recession? They have to stoke demand. And how do they stoke demand? Well, we can lower interest rates or we can give cash payments. This time around, the government is using both. The Federal Reserve, from, since the pandemic began, the Federal Reserve has put interest rates incredibly low. I should look, I'm not responsible, professor, has made them incredibly low and has said that they are going to keep them low for a very long time in order to bolster consumer confidence. And then on top of that, there will be payments of $600 and now $1,400. Where do you think most people spend their money? $600. Oh gosh, never mind. Hold on to that question. Let me see what Jesse and Jessica have to say. I don't know who was first. Oh, Jesse was first, according to my list here. Go for it.
Okay. I was just thinking, you mentioned that lowering interest rates raises demand, which then puts money back into the economy and makes more jobs, et cetera. When people have money, there's more need for jobs to meet the demands. So couldn't you apply that same logic to raising the living wage or raising the minimum wage? Like, wouldn't that in effect put more money into consumers' pockets to spend, which would in turn like cause small businesses and large businesses to hire more people to meet the demand that they're making?
I think that is a counter argument I've heard. That is a good point. Absolutely. Because who is getting the money, right? You're giving it to generally, who will be benefited? Generally low-income people. Where will they be spending their money? That's the question. See, Gabe already threw out an answer there. I said, where will people be spending this money? Key presupposition. They need to spend it. You get it? They cannot save it. They must not save it. Saving the goddamn money doesn't help. You got to go out and spend that cash money. Where are you going to spend it? Most McDonald's workers, I wager, are not spending it on stock. And Vinny is completely wrong. And I don't know what GME is. It must be gross.
You don't need to know.
Thank you. Seriously. Guess whose stock boomed last year? Sorry, Jessica, I know you're next. I just wanted to sneak this in. Whose stock boomed last year because everybody was spending their Trump dollars? Where do people shop? All over the country. Where do they
Amazon.
Yeah, yes, they did well. That's accurate. Walmart. Walmart boomed. Everybody goes to Walmart. Everybody spends money at Walmart. Tesla, they don't spend it on Tesla, although they did okay last year. Okay, Jessica, before I get carried away.
I'm just curious what you would have to say about the idea that maybe the lack of inflation has to do with a correlation between the rise in productivity and the stagnation of wages. If we continue to make more and more things each year and they cost the same and we're being paid the same because all that extra money from the productivity is going to the people up top, does that have something to do with it?
I think so. That's exactly what I was trying to say. So I'm teaching a parallel class to this at Hopkins right now. And I was teaching von Mises the other day, and I have never had this before, but I have a Friedman acolyte in this class. And he was saying, if you raise minimum wages, those will go, it's a terrible idea because those companies are only going to take that cost and pass it on to the consumers, right? So going back to our example of consumer, was it corporate coffee, which is easily the worst name for a coffee chain I've ever heard. Don't do it. Corporate coffee is going to charge, right? They hire so-and-so at $7 and then they're told to go to 15. They're like, oh my God, well, see this latte here? This used to be $3.75. Now it's $8.75. Suck on that. And I didn't dispute this guy because like, that's coming. He's getting the smackdown. But the thing is, companies have a choice, right? They have choices where to absorb those costs. And if they pass it on to the consumers, it's kind of dumb. Well, of course, in a country where $15 federal wage is mandated across the economy, then everybody's raising the prices on consumers, everybody. But a smart company, Friedman would say, is, look at this is an example directly out of the book, all the coffee companies, right? You raise the wage $15 an hour. All the coffee companies say, okay, guess what? We're all raising the price on latte. Latte, $8 an hour. I'm like choking on the thought of this. But then there's this smart little coffee shop down in Hamden, right? Kind of hipster. They're like, fuck it. We're gonna do $6 lattes. And then guess what? Then everybody's like, well, screw corporate coffee. We're going to go to, I don't know, we'll go to this other coffee shop. I'm not one for names, get down there. So, and they might, and that other shop might decide to make the savings elsewhere, right? Like say, like, we're not going to have couches, right? Or our CEO is not going to make an exorbitant salary, or, I don't know, there's a variety of ways that you can save money. The corporations can save money. How's that sound, Jessica? Is that what you were thinking of? Yeah. I have to tell you one more thing, though, before we get off this topic of living wage, is there is another problem with it. And I will be totally honest and tell you that I have not paid really close attention to this legislation. I just have seen conservatives upset with it. $15 an hour. This started in New York. And in New York, that makes sense, right? Or you understand why it's hard in New York, because New York is so goddamn expensive. But a $15 wage means something very different in New York than it does in, say, Kentucky or Tennessee or Alabama or Alaska. See the point? And one thing I would need to do is I would need to look at the legislation and see if they are going to give some kind of exoneration for different areas, because in certain areas, $15 wage, you can live like a king, right? Hell, you can buy a house in Detroit for $5,000. Any takers? I'll work on you. We'll get there. Anyway, so maybe it's in Biden's legislation, but I think that is a concern. Alabama's is still 725. Yeah. What I'm talking about is something like purchasing power. That's what I'm really talking about, purchasing power. A dollar means a lot less in New York City than it does, in like rural Illinois, so don't you have to take that into account as well when you're talking about a living wage and, what corporations have an obligation to pay in terms of salary? Any other questions? Yes, Ella, go for it.
This is less of a question and more of a comment, or like, I don't know, just like a statement in general.
Yeah.
But like with the internet, I feel like the wage, I guess not like the wage, but like the prices of things have become more standardized because so many people are purchasing things like through the internet. And I know that that's like not true, obviously, with like real estate, but like as far as like, I don't know, like computers and like anything that you primarily purchase online, like that is still going to be the same cost.
There's a standardization, right? Standardization of prices of, especially when it comes to like consumer commodities. Yeah, I get it. It's funny. Just before I got on Zoom here, I was reading this article on the Atlantic. It's called "The Demise of Superstar Cities," because people now can live anywhere in the country because they're working remotely. Like cities like New York and San Francisco, for the first time, are seeing their rents decline and real estate prices decline. And this guy was talking about how it's a real thing now. Like Zillow has gotten so popular in the last year. You guys know Zillow? It's a website where you can look at, and like people go on there like pornography, and they're looking. There was an SNL skit this weekend about this, but people fantasizing about living in different areas. Like, I have a studio apartment in Manhattan, but look at the mansion I could get in Phoenix. Right. So there may be standardization of commodity prices. Elle, you're totally right. And that's an excellent point. But when it comes to other things like food, eating out, restaurants, gas prices, and housing, of course, there's going to be low geographical variation. Good. Anybody else? Good. I'm happy to have conversations like this with you all, because I feel like, I want you to talk about things that, are of interest to you. And if you have questions about economics, this is a forum for you to ask them, which you generally won't get in other classes. So feel free to do this. Ariana has a comment about Florida. I bet that's South Florida, Ariana. That's probably not Tallahassee, right?
Yeah, I'm in Miami now.
Yeah, Miami's quite different. See, even within states, you have huge variation. Well, instead of complaining, Ariana, go live in Tallahassee.
Okay.
You're free to choose. What do you think? Huh?
But if everyone goes to live in Tallahassee,
No, then you don't. Then you go live in Little Rock. Okay? You can't have everybody going to Tallahassee.
Then what if everyone goes to Little Rock after they go to
No,
Tallahassee?
Sean, you're just imagining everybody like herd mentality. No, you got to have, this is the beauty of the free market, right? Prices in Little Rock will zoom up. Well, then you'll move to another city, right? That's how this goes. In theory. Okay. That's the theory. That's not always the reality. Okay. I have a cousin who lives up in New York and in Westchester County, and real estate is so high, and he has huge taxes to pay for his kids in school. And that's my cousin. And then I had a buddy, he bought a 9-bedroom mansion in Philadelphia for a couple $100,000. So I texted my cousin. I said, you got to take a look at this. And he said to me, what do you, excuse me? You expect me to uproot my family and my kids and my wife and migrate down there? And my kids have their social setting, their network. So my point is that the theory is very different from the practice, right? People like Friedman would say, you are free to choose. That's easier than it sounds. You're not always free to choose. You have certain choices that are not really choices, or I should put it that the free market demands things of you that you may not like. Okay. I want to do a couple things here to really get us deeper into Friedman. Okay. First thing I'm going to talk about farm subsidies. Favorite topic. I fucking love farm subsidies. And this kind of problematizes his idea of choice. Now he says subsidies, this comes up on page 17, where he's cheerleading the virtues of the price system, right? Prices, they transmit information. They tell you, if a pencil is 27 cents, tells you how much demand there is, how much supply, right? And he says the price system, when it gets gummed up or blocked, this is by the government. And the examples he gives are tariffs and subsidies. By the way, tariff, I may know what's a tariff?
It's taxes or fees imposed on an imported item.
Yeah. Anybody know an imported item that is taxed?
Well, there's actually all of the Japanese pickup trucks that are sold in the United States are manufactured in the United States because there was a huge, tariff law passed way back where vans and pickup trucks from foreign places were heavily taxed, because they didn't want the United States to lose so much of its industry and competitive advantage in that regard.
Thank you. So I forget when that was imposed, but why did they impose it? I'm going to imagine they imposed it because there were congressmen from Michigan who said, listen, American jobs are being lost by these Japanese truck imports. Okay. By the way, American car manufacturers are not very competitive. There is only one area where they kick butt in, and that is trucks. That's their only profit-making venture of the big three, GM, Ford, and Chrysler, okay? I'm not talking about Tesla, which does not have a truck as far as I know. Anyway, trucks is huge. This is big business. Japanese manufacturers have killed them with Toyota, with the sedans, right? And then they muscle in with their trucks, and we have to protect American jobs. So let's make sure that there's a tariff imposed on trucks. But then Friedman says, okay, but now you consumer are being punished for this because now you're being denied a cheaper and possibly better product, right? For the argument of saving people's jobs. Okay. Now, in a traditional free market system, we would not have those tariffs. The Japanese truck manufacturers will come in, and they might do great damage. What should happen in a free market system without government intervention? What should happen to US truck manufacturers? Anyone want to play this game? Yes.
What are you asking about the trucks?
If there were no tariffs to protect US truck manufacturing, and the Japanese trucks did actually take over and really diminish market share of like Ford and GM trucks.
Well, I think one of the things that's being overlooked here is the response from the foreign manufacturers to make and assemble vehicles, at least partially in the United States. Like, I think, yes, maybe that allows for better competition because they're using their local manufacturing and shipping stuff over from Japan or what have you. But I also feel like, at least now that it's kind of played out and developed, there's been such an incentive to invest in manufacturing again that like there's a revival of jobs in the Sun Belt and the South.
Yeah.
From Toyota and Honda and these foreign manufacturers to make things like the Titan and the Ridgeline and the Pilot and whatever. And I feel like that has positively benefited the economy because these companies are so big, they're able to like transplant their design and way of making internationally, hire American workers, and then sell a competitive product that ultimately makes the Americans like stay sharp. But I would say that like in the early times, and this was introduced like the 80s and early 90s, like, maybe it's questionable. I don't know.
Well, you're right. The Japanese manufacturers, they ended up doing the best thing possible for their own brand, right? Setting up shop here did wonders for their own brand. So this example is not going to work terribly great for me. But Jessica, you had your hand up. Did you want to say something?
I was just gonna say that, like, in answer to your question of like what were to happen if there were no tariffs and they could come in and wreck it, like the response would have to be that United States manufacturers improve their product enough to make it more desirable and then flip it back onto us so that we don't even want the Japanese cars anymore because ours are good enough.
Find a way to make these trucks better and more cheaply, or make something different. What? I have no idea. Use your imagination. Or those workers are out of business. And then they have to find new jobs. And they are affected. Then how do they shop in the marketplace? Well, the free market solution is that they have to sell their labor at an effective price, at an attractive price, i.e. cheap. This is the free market solution. All right. I'm going to give an example that I think will hopefully. That was a great example, Daniel, and I liked it very much, but I'm going to give a little bit less complicated one. Oranges. I discovered a few years ago, oranges from Brazil. They have a huge tariff. I want to say like 30%. Why? Air. Lay it on us.
I'd assume that probably because the government like probably subsidizes like Florida's orange farms a lot, and that's why they don't want to like lose money on like putting in a lot of like investing in Florida oranges. I don't know. That's
Well,
what
let's hang on. First of all, Air, let's not use those words interchangeably. They're actually two separate things. A subsidy and a tariff are two separate things. However, they end up having the same effect. Okay. It's a little complicated. Tariff, you're taxing the import. Subsidy, you're giving money to your local farmers to help them out. Okay. So it's not that the orange farmers were given a subsidy, it's that their competitors were taxed.
Mhm.
What can you all tell me about the price? Well, oranges, they're in Florida and they're in California. How do you think that the cost of labor compares between Florida and Brazil? Just take a guess. Which is more expensive?
Florida.
Yes, it is. Anything from the developing world is going to be cheaper. Therefore, American Florida orange growers cannot compete head to head with anybody growing oranges in the developing world. They just can't. So the only way you're going to keep an orange growing economy in Florida is to tax the imports. Okay. And this is exactly the kind of thing that Friedman says is unfair. You're cheating. You're cheating. All right, Mr. Friedman. We'll take away those tariffs. Then what? Somebody play the game. What happens?
Brazil gets to sell their oranges here, and then our orange farms and everyone who works at them and all the production of that gets ruined because nobody's buying them anymore.
Excellent. That's the bad news.
They would have to make their oranges cheaper, as cheap as the Brazil ones, in order to get us to buy them. And then they would have to pay their people less or lose employees or something like that.
And if they can't, then they go out of business or they repurpose their business. What else can they do with those orange groves in Florida, everybody? Come on.
Orange juice.
Well, no, I just told you the oranges are bad business, bro. They're being lost because of no, you're gonna have to chop down your orange trees, buddy. Luckily, other things grow in Florida. I don't know if you knew that. You feel me? You know where I'm going here? Drugs. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not talking about drugs at all.
Grapefruits.
Okay, but I tell you what, they sell grapefruits out of Brazil too, pretty cheap. Mangoes, Gabe. He's right. Except they grow mangoes in Haiti, and Haiti's really cheap. So you see how this is going? The Friedman argument is you have to figure out in the free market, you have to do what you can do best and most efficiently with your land instead of cheating. Okay? You're cheating the American customer right now. You're cheating the American customer by selling him, forcing on him Florida oranges. He could be getting those Brazilian oranges for cheaper. The American consumer is being robbed. And he's right. He is being robbed. You're putting up with some bullshit here. You have to work. You have to think about ways to do this. I don't know. I mean, when it comes to farming, however, it becomes very tricky, right? Farmers don't easily pivot to do something completely different with their land. Their options are incredibly limited, right? Where I am, north of Baltimore City, there's a couple of ingenious farms. They have, in the fall, they have corn mazes. And they have miniature zoos for school kids to come visit. But how many farms can do that, right? Ideally, you would find a product that you can sell. that'll make you some money. You know what I mean? And offhand, I can't think of any for Florida that like in the absence of tariffs, they'd be able to sell. I just can't think of any. You know, maybe you turn the rest of Florida into an amusement park. And I mean the whole thing.
It's a big Airbnb.
I was thinking more like Disney World, my friend.
Gator Farms.
Gator Farms, there you go. I'm joking, but I mean, not entirely. You know, this is how the free market forces you to think. So let's talk about corn, right? So corn, everybody knows, is the big subsidized product. As a result, so by the way, there are many countries in the world that grow corn. Actually, the most subsidized crop in America is rice. And the reason rice is the most subsidized is because rice is grown in many countries around the world for much less, right? Much less input, much less wages. So the only way that American rice farmers can compete is when they get tremendous subsidies. By the way, subsidies, everybody, equal direct payments from the government. Okay. In the United States, we have, you know, rice is a major subsidy, but it's, you know, it's subsidized because it can't compete with other crops around the world. Corn is subsidized heavily, and it can be grown much more cheaply in Mexico, for example. In order to keep American farmers afloat, the result of this corn subsidy has been that we have, and this is a technical term, we have a shit ton of corn, okay? And by shit ton, I mean like trillions of shit tons. Where does it all go? The correct answer is American thighs. You were going to say that, right?
I was going to say landfills, but that's a second.
No, seriously though, where do you see corn? Where does corn show up? Animal feed. Thank you, Jessica. Cornbread. Gabe, not very creative. Jesse's right. Ella's right. Daphne's right. Everything you can think of is made of a fucking piece of corn. Here's what you do, y'all. After class field trip, go down to 7-Eleven, meander through the aisles with your mask on, of course, flip over any processed food. 6/10 of the products are made of corn. And 4/10 are made of soy. Why? Why, you ask? Because it's subsidized. So you see what's happened here? You could make Cheetos out of other things. No, you can't. Cheetos are corn. You know, any case, look how we're deciding the ingredients for our processed food products. We're like, what do we have a shitload of lying around? We're like, oh, we have a lot of soy right here and we have a lot of corn right here. Well, then let's do whatever we can. Corn, it has made its way into plastics. It's made its way into batteries. It's made its way into fuel. And I think fuel exemplifies the problem here. When you go to, ever since Obama took over, basically was president, when you go to the fuel, get gas, just about every single gas station now, 10% of your fuel is ethanol. Okay, you may have noticed that. It says it on the pump. Ethanol is fuel made from plants. Now, in Brazil, for example, they make it from sugarcane, and it's incredibly, that's Brazil. It's incredibly efficient, apparently. They have a lot of sugarcane. They squeeze the sugar out. They take the rest. They make fuel out of it. Apparently, it's a very efficient and good fuel. You know what makes a very shitty ethanol? Corn. In fact, corn makes the shittiest ethanol of all. But you go down to Exxon, and guess what your ethanol is? It's corn ethanol. And why is it corn ethanol? Because that's what we got a shit ton of. Okay. Apparently, corn ethanol is bad for is bad for fuel efficiency. It actually makes your cars less fuel efficient. That's how bad it is. There are hundreds of other plants. I once heard a very provocative show on NPR about how willow trees are the best source of ethanol because they're quick growing and the stuff they produce is just very high quality fuel, but not corn. By the way, somebody mentioned corn going into animal feed. Which animal? Which animal gets corn in particular?
Chickens.
Yes, they do. Cows. Yeah, I mean, they all do. The answer is they all do. I kind of, that's a trick question. But there is a problem, though. Look at our list here. Chickens and cows. Who do you think? There's a problem here. One of those animals should not be getting corn. Do you know which one and why? Who knows their animal physiology? Come on, people. Cows should not eat corn. That is accurate. What should cows eat? God made
Grass.
cows eat grass. That's how they were designed by Jesus himself. That's why they have those flat molars. That's why they have two stomachs. They're called ruminants. They burp and they create methane. They're supposed to eat grass. They're not supposed to eat corn. About 15 years ago, Michael Pollan wrote a great book called The Omnivore's Dilemma, where he talks about food and agriculture. And he argues that we're effectively turning cows in this country, we're turning them into diabetics because we are force feeding them corn until the age of 15 months, whereupon they will be. It's a great book, Chloe. I love it. He has other good stuff too. So you got, let me pause here for a second because I've kind of been rambling. I told you I like to talk about subsidies. So anybody, questions? All right, I'm going to take one more step. What's been the impact of all the corn and soy on the American diet? Jesse just like, can I have some specifics? Anybody know what's going on with the American diet?
It's bad.
Okay. We have a diabetes epidemic. We have an obesity epidemic, hypertension, heart disease. Because we're force feeding ourselves this shit. Back when Obama became president in 2008, I wrote an article about this at the time. Michelle, her initiative was a vegetable garden on the grounds of the White House because she wanted to showcase healthy eating. At the very same time, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and this kind of feeds exactly into what Friedman's talking about, the U.S. Department of Agriculture was advertising a 6-cheese pizza for Domino's. Okay, why is USD holding their water? We've talked about corn and we've talked about soy and sugar, but we have not talked about milk. Milk is one of the biggest beneficiaries of government subsidies because dairy farmers, they would go bankrupt without it. So in order to advance the cause of our dairy farmers, the USDA was coming up with these outrageously fat and heavy pizzas, even sneaking the cheese into the crust, right, to sell our goods. So you had one hand, you had Michelle trying to get people to eat healthier diets. On one hand, USDA is advancing the cause of these farmers and making us all sick. So not great. All right. I'm going to pause for a second. Anybody have any questions or comments? So in general, subsidies, they deform the prices. They corrupt the price system. Okay. And, without subsidies, what would the price of corn be? I don't know. What would the price of soy be? I don't know. Maybe I've suggested that, effectively, people, beef is subsidized effectively. It's not direct, but it's effectively subsidized, and it's effectively subsidized because the feed is subsidized, right? If you took those subsidies away, what would the cost of a McDonald's hamburger be? $7? $11?
Couldn't we just get corn for cheaper from Mexico or something like that?
Oh, right. Then we're back down to $1. Thanks for saving the American way of life, Jesse. Okay, never mind. Then scratch my example. What I was going to say is that if you got rid of subsidies, maybe you make Americans healthier, but you're right. We just get our cheap shit from elsewhere. So scratch that. And Jesse, you're completely right. I've been reading the last few years that in the developing world, now that meat has gotten cheaper, you're seeing the same affliction of American style health problems, like in India and in China and in South America and Africa. I've read a big article in The Economist about Africa this weekend. The diabetes is just through the roof now because they're modeling our affinity for Cheetos and whatnot. All right. Questions, comments? I dabbled into this example about subsidies to do two things. I wanted to point out to you that Friedman is not all wrong. I mean, he has some good points. My dad has a farm up in Pennsylvania. When I visit up there, I'm disgusted when I see all the corn and soy, for miles and miles. And but then if you took those subsidies away, what would those farmers do? How would those farmers compete? Suggestions?
Farm grass for the cows.
There is a farmer in Virginia, profiled in Omnivore's Dilemma, by the way, who he does that. He says, I have the cheapest feed of all. Of course, beef farmers will also tell you it takes much longer to fatten a cow, and you're not getting as fat a cow. The reason you use corn is because it's very tasty, and you get a fat cow much quicker. Well, I should tell you all something. It turns out near my dad's farm in Pennsylvania, there are a couple farmers that are doing okay. And they're called Amish. Who are the Amish? We have international students here who might know who the Amish are. So who are the Amish, everybody?
Protestants.
Well, sort of, yes. That's their least interesting feature, though. Am I know?
They're Mennonites.
They are.
Like seclusionist people who live in micro societies outside of major metropolitans. They live in rural areas.
Good. Jessica.
Yeah, they every Amish community has general rules about not using technology to certain extents, and they basically don't participate in our society. They don't use the technology that we use. They have some farm equipment that's that uses certain modern technologies, but generally they are not in this culture.
Good. So if anybody's interested, they're right up the road from Baltimore. They're in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. That's their original community on the East Coast. But they've had to migrate quite a bit because they have a lot of children. And I think Ohio has the biggest community now. And the Amish farmers are the only farmers that are really able to make it financially. What is it? What do you think? Why do you think they're able to make it? Actually, I think Jessica probably gave us enough information to tell you why they're able to survive, whereas commercial farmers are not. What's the secret to the Amish success? Rachel?
That they work all the time to make all this stuff, which is really delicious stuff most of the time, really well-made stuff. And then they sell it for a period of time, and then they do church on the other day that they rest.
Thank you. And what do they spend their money on?
That is a great question.
Oh. See what I'm doing here? That's what they spend their money on. Jack shit.
Okay, cool.
Did you hear the part where Jessica pointed out they don't have technology? How fucking cheap would your life be? No car, no computer.
They make everything.
They
They
make
don't buy
everything.
things, yeah.
You all are practically Amish already. You already make everything. Now just cut all the other stuff out of your life. Wait a minute, Mr. Friedman. Are you fucking telling me that if I want to make it as a farmer, I could either sell corn subsidized, which is bad, and you take away my subsidies, I got to be like the Amish? Oh, that sucks.
The Amish people that sell in Annapolis, they have calculators, and I know for a fact that they all get there via a van where like they drive down from Pennsylvania.
Very tricky. You have just landed upon this thing called the rubber Amish, and the rubber Amish are this like it's like Orthodox Jews. You have varying degrees of Amish, and some of them will cheat. And the rubber Amish, some rubber Amish even have a car, but the hardcore Amish, which are a lot, they got nothing. They plow their fields with an ox. Just imagine a combine harvester. If you're a traditional farmer farming corn, a combine harvester costs over $100,000. An Amish farmer doesn't have that expense at all. Of course, he doesn't go anywhere. So how much is an ox? Good question. I don't know. But you could feed that ox grass. My dad is very nosy, and my dad's from Belgium, so he speaks German. He drives in there and he starts speaking to the Amish farmers who are all very shy. And he told me, oh, their donkeys are very skinny donkeys. They're not feeding their donkeys. So, and by the way, the Amish have been dinged for animal welfare issues. But anyway, so, you're a traditional farmer, you're not doing too well, the subsidies is gone. Then what do? You could, I mean, the traditional free market argument is you got to sell something you have to pick a different product that sells. What's it going to be? Oh, shit. Shiitake mushrooms. Nope. Can't compete. Okay. What grows well here in this part of Pennsylvania or Maryland? Tomatoes, can you compete? Right. And so it goes. By the way, the other trick of survival for the Amish is that they don't practice something called monoculture. They practice polyculture, which means they grow many different things. Traditional American farmers rely on one or two crops, corn and soy. But Amish farms, not only do they have no expenses, but they grow vegetables, potatoes, they raise cattle, they raise sheep, they have a lot of different things going, right? Which means, yes, they have to work very hard, and they do. They have that work ethic. All right. Other issues, questions, comments?
I was curious if we're gonna talk like specifically about the pollution idea and the responsibility of the government in terms of climate change.
Sure, I'll do that now. Let me see what Sean has to say. Go for it.
I was going to ask, what if we just go to a completely free market without the government, what would there be to stop inflation?
Tricky question. Well, as Friedman himself reveals in the opening of his book, that there are varying degrees of government interventionism, right? And actually, there's not a single free market guy who thinks there should be no government intervention. He just says there should be very little of it. This is my way of saying that you could still keep government intervention for that, right? All you need is a Federal Reserve to raise interest rates. That's all you need, and that would hold inflation in check, right? And I don't know any free market capitalists that would get rid of the Federal Reserve. I can't think of any that are against that. So we're safe from that. Good. All right, I'm going to do two things. And by the way, everybody, just so you know, I am going to go till 6 today, okay? Because I have two major things I want to talk about with you. The first thing I want to talk about is I want to discuss what he gets into in chapter 7. And the reason I want to do that, and I'm going to use the example that Jessica raises. And the reason I want to do that is because I actually think that this is one of his most powerful arguments. I was prepared to talk about the ICC, but Jessica is pushing us towards EPA, which is perfectly fine. So first, let's talk about the EPA, and then we'll take on Jessica's question. What's the problem with the EPA, according to him? What's his argument? The Environmental Protection Agency. Sounds like a good idea. Why shouldn't we protect the environment? Someone going to tell us what's the problem with the EPA? Well, before we talk about the consumer, let's just talk about the agency itself. What's the problem with all those government agencies he mentions in chapter 7? Jessica.
Yeah, that they basically turn their focus into not what they started the agency for, and they it just becomes more about like having the control over it and not what they do with the control. So basically they become useless and they stop doing their job, and it actually does more harm than good in different cases for each agency. So
nice. Yep, very good. Jesse.
Basically, kind of what I got out of it in a very watered down way is that they focus too much on like right and wrong and not enough on like buying and selling and the economy and what's actually sustainable. So they're like very nearsighted. They don't predict long-term consequences.
Good. Lack of incentive, Daphne. What are you getting at?
Like they don't care if like about the environment, so they're just like they get paid by the government anyway, so they're just like
bureaucrats. Yeah good. Okay. You know what, one thing he's addressing in this chapter that is very important, we discussed about this last week we talked about monopoly, okay? And as I pointed out, according to Marx, that's the big danger of a free market that's left alone to its own devices, right? The virtue of the free market is competition. But as we discussed last week, some companies learn how to compete better than others, and those are the ones that get big. And as they get bigger, they tend to buy up all the competitors until you end up with one. And monopoly sucks, right? Monopoly is the worst. Then they can do whatever they want prices. They can do whatever they want with wages. So the argument is you need government intervention to ward against monopoly. Friedman has a very interesting retort. He insists that a free market can resolve monopoly on its own. You do not need government intervention to ward off monopoly. In fact, monopoly and monopolies are always created through government assistance. Okay. He illustrates this on page 195 when he's talking about the ICC. Now, the ICC, this is not something I know much about. I got to be honest with you, because, you know, rails, they're terrible. Actually, anybody been on Amtrak? This kind of illustrates the problem of monopoly very well. How's Amtrak? Kind of sucks, huh? Prices are outrageously high. I used to go to school in Boston. The train from Baltimore to Boston, 8 hours. Do you know how long it takes to drive from Baltimore to Boston? 8 hours. What the fuck? Why would I take a train? And they're rude. And the seats are falling apart. It's gross, right? And Amtrak is run by the government. Chloe.
Yeah, I'm from Virginia Beach, Virginia. So before the pandemic, I spent a lot of time our first couple of years going between my hometown and Baltimore on an Amtrak.
Yeah.
It's the end of the Northwest Regional, like on the south side.
Yeah.
And there were so many times where like my parents would come pick me up and they'll be like, I mean, we'll never do it, but we could have driven to get you faster.
Yeah. No, the Amtrak is terrible. And this is where Friedman says, look, see, I told you so. So the story of the ACC is it is a regulatory agency that was brought in to, you know, I don't know what, to clean up problems in the rail industry. He describes when it was created in the 1800s, there were complaints about prices, okay? And there were complaints about service, and the ICC would come in. And guess what? It was created to solve consumer complaints. But it turns out the rail companies were happy for the intervention because they could use the agency to like protect themselves against consumer complaints, right? And he says you see this pattern over and over again. The FDA, who regulates pharmaceutical companies, serves the same purpose, right? For the pharmaceutical industry, and the EPA as well. But there's a nice quote here on page 195 I want to call your attention to, and I will address Rachel's question in just a second. On page 195, he talks about, in the middle of 195, he says, the railroad men of the time tried to improve their position by joining together, forming pools. This was before the ICC. Agreeing to fix rates at profitable levels and to divide the market. To their dismay, the agreements were always breaking down. So long as the rest of the members of a pool kept up their rates, any one member could benefit by cutting his rates. This is the example I was trying to emulate earlier when I was talking about the price of lattes going up, and then you have that renegade coffee maker in Hamden who decides, right, to lower prices. This is his thinking. This is why monopoly never actually materializes in a free market. Because in a free market, you'll always have some SOB who's like, you know what? Monopoly happens when big manufacturers come together and say, big corporate interests, they say, okay, we're gonna fix prices. But you could always have one member who is like a maverick and runs away and sets his or her own prices, and then suddenly the market gravitates there and everybody has to lower prices again, right? He just doesn't think that monopoly can last on a totally free market. Chloe, did you want to say something else? Okay, I guess not. So the interesting thing is the railroads turned to the government and government intervention for their own advantage. And this had the effect of establishing monopoly power through government protection. Okay. And Amtrak, what's the result? Is a monopoly. It's a government-run monopoly, and they certainly behave like a monopoly. I don't understand why they don't feel the pressure to be more efficient. Do they really think it's okay that a train should take 8 hours from Baltimore to Boston? Do they really think for $250? Do they really think that? Where do they get off? What's going on here? They feel no impetus to innovate, right? An ordinary business is going to have to play ball, but they don't feel they have to. All right, Rachel. Yes. And what's interesting, the big retort to Friedman is always this: Oh, in Europe, the train systems are run by the government and they run well. And that is accurate. Like British Rail is very good and very cheap. So I don't know. I don't have time or mental space to think about that right now, but that's something to think on. And I'll put some more energy into that in the future. But Jessica wanted us to talk about the EPA. So we better do that. And you were actually, Jessica, it was the question about, I think you wanted to hear about, environmental change has to come from the consumer, right?
Yeah, I guess one of the things I wanted to hear about, and I don't know, this made me think a lot about Biden's address about his executive orders to get the the climate committees together. And he said, like, on 3 different occasions, the sentence, "There's money to be made in saving the environment."
Yeah.
And he referenced like venture capitalists and the car companies, and he framed saving the planet, it's like combating climate change, in terms of making money, and how the government and companies, like whether it's government regulations or whatever, everyone's gonna make money because we're saving the environment. And that just kept popping back into my head when I was reading about this. And I think that matters in this conversation.
Yeah. And that rubs you the wrong way. You don't like it.
Yeah, I think it's I guess it makes sense in some way that there's like that's the incentive, I guess, is that these companies are going to make money by making these switches. But I just think the incentive really that would be ideal is that everyone understands that this is for like the greater good of everything on the planet, humanity itself, as well as all living things. Like, I just don't understand why it has to be about the financial gains from it.
Anybody have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I want to say that Biden seems like the kind of guy that tries to play both sides in a slick way. And, I've had a lot of experience along with Aria in working closely with sponsor companies at MICA that kind of give us like branding overview talks, and they speak about how they're making things environmentally friendly and how it ends up saving them money. And I always like to think about, trying to sell products in a dead planet. If there's no one to sell things to, like, how are you going to exist? And I just, I think there's 2 sides to what Biden's saying. Biden's kind of one making a concession to be like, hey, look, like, this is a business venture. Here's feed into your greed. But also like if you want to continue being greedy in the future, like, the world needs to exist. So it's shitty, but like it's better than nothing.
Thank you, Jesse.
Yeah, I mean, this whole topic is obviously very unnerving how it's actually playing out in real life. And of course, I'm sane, and I think that we need to prioritize saving the environment now so we can have a future. But the reason Biden talks about the finance of it is that a huge portion of our country doesn't care about the environment right now. They only care about making money. And so then that poses the question, should the government have the power to just overrule a huge portion of its citizens for the greater good? Isn't that kind of the opposite of what democracy is all about? It's very undemocratic if the majority of our country wants to say, fuck the earth, let's make our bread now. It would be kind of undemocratic to not to fight that, but to overrule that and force them to adapt.
I think, sorry, Jesse.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. It's just a shitty truth, I think.
I think Friedman's main argument would be that the consumer has to take the lead here because that is the most efficient way to get things done. If you want the most efficient response to environmental degradation, consumer choice has to lead the way. Olivia.
It kind of reminds me of the whole deal with wearing masks in a way, because I heard like all these different things about, how we advertised wearing a mask as helping other people before we advertised it as helping ourselves. And maybe if we just started with saying wear a mask because it helps you, then we would have had more people wearing masks. I think it's just kind of interesting how everything has to, we have to convince everyone that it's going to benefit them in order to get people to do things.
You're very cynical, Olivia. I like it. You're a good old American. Well, listen, I mean, I think, I think it's very sensible what you say. I mean, people, this is a basic tenet of Friedman's thinking, that people will more reliably think about themselves and their own benefits than others. This quote from Adam Smith at the beginning of chapter 7 really struck me. He said, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest." The butcher is not butchering the meat for you because he wants to do a bang up job or give you the best meat possible. He wants the dollar. And the whole point for Friedman and Adam Smith is that that's not a problem. That's something we need to take advantage of. People can be, right? Definitely mention incentive. People can be most reliably motivated when they're thinking of their own self-interest, when it comes to the environment, unfortunately, environmental benefits are so abstract that you still have to talk in terms of dollars. But I would like to point out, and Evan, I see your hand, that Ayer is right. I think that the reason he's talking this way, and I don't think it's correct of him to do this, is I think he's trying to create some middle ground with the Republicans, because they're only listening. They don't even believe in climate change. They're only listening to arguments for prosperity. Problem is, they're never going to compromise with them. So fuck them. Why bother? Just do your thing, Evan.
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, you said something about how we should pass the responsibility onto the consumers of like the environmental pollution and things that are going on. But it's not that simple, because we can't just stop buying everything that is polluting the environment, and we can't just cut off every company that is causing the pollution, because if we could, we would have by now.
The big problem is also consumer knowledge, right? I just got into a fight with my wife about this the other day. I don't want to criticize her. She's a good person, but she started buying these pods, for the dishwasher. And I've been dutifully putting them in the machine. And then the other day I'm looking at this pod. I'm like, what happens to all the microplastics? Obviously they go in the fucking bay. But do people think this way? Do people know? I think a lot of consumers, he's going to put it on consumers to lead the way, but consumers are very limited in what they're able to do, as you point out, Evan, and what they're able to know. Most American consumers are relying on cars to get anywhere, right? They can't afford a fucking Tesla, okay? And they're not going to bike or walk. So it's a tall order to put that on the plate of consumers. That said, when consumers have indicated an appetite, boy, companies really do pay attention. Okay, they really do. He's not wrong about that. Teresa, asks, has there been any response or attempts to Friedman's proposed effluent charge? You know what struck me is that this is very reminiscent of the carbon tax that's been proposed. That's effectively what he's talking about. So before you brand, see, this is what I was saying about Friedman at the beginning. Be careful how you brand this guy. He is not your, even though he's been inspiration conservatives all over the country, he's not very conservative in many ways. And this is a program that, you know, carbon tax that is anathema to many conservatives in government today. But the reason he likes it is because it would force companies to make choices, you know. And by the way, this is against regulations, so it's not exactly a great idea. The point is, right, we're not going to bar you. So, for example, I'll give an example to illustrate. Here in Baltimore, the biggest pollutant in the bay are chicken farms on the Eastern Shore. Purdue, you guys heard of Purdue? And the chicken farms, they're sending basically chicken waste into the bay. And so the levels of nitrogen are spiking and the grasses are growing and they're robbing the bay of oxygen. And so there's fewer fish and crabs because there are dead zones in the bay. Maryland has a host of laws and regulations which are quite onerous that forbid chicken farmers, who are not very wealthy, by the way, they must, this is what you must do with the chicken shit. This is how you must collect it. You must put up this barrier around it. You may have it so many feet away from a stream, right? Et cetera, et cetera. And the farmers complain and they bitch and they moan about every regulation because, listen, it is expensive and annoying. And, you know, they'll be fined if they make a mistake. All right. Those are the kinds of regulations that Friedman would get rid of. In exchange, he would have an effluent tax where he'd effectively say to the chicken farmer, you want to pollute? Oh, okay. Here's your tax. And then that chicken farmer can choose. And he thinks that's more effective at prompting them to choose against pollution. But that's another universe for us all to contemplate tonight, right? Before you go to bed, lie in bed and think about all the farmers free to pollute as they will, but they'll be charged a tax as opposed to being forbidden outright, you know. He seems to think it would be much more effective. So the short answer to your question, Teresa, is I don't know. I can't think of any that have been, I can tell you that none of them imposed in the manner he proposes, where we get rid of regulations. But the contemporary analog to that is this carbon tax, where companies will be taxed on the amount of carbon they emit into the atmosphere, and this should be an incentive for them to reduce what they emit. I mean, the way it works in Maryland, as I think it does in most states, is if you pollute, you're fined. They don't call it a tax, you're just fined. But many companies, they treat this as a cost of doing business, which is to say, like, they are repeat offenders. Like, I know Smithfield, I don't know if you guys have heard of Smithfield, they make the ham down in Virginia. They are notorious for their environmental problems. There's a good book about them and other companies by Jonathan Safran Foer. I think the book's called Eating Animals. Very good book. And he has a chapter or two in there about Smithfield. And Smithfield, they so repeatedly spill pig shit into the rivers and are fined, they just treat it like a tax, but it's not called a tax, of course. Teresa.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think the effluent charge thing is like really interesting because Friedman's kind of pushing businesses into a corner where they kind of have to adapt to situations. And I was thinking a lot about how I thought it was strange in a lot of the his discussion, how he frames it around anecdotes about like the electrical companies and stuff, but he's not framing it around businesses that are creating less necessary goods and stuff. And like I was thinking about with like the fast fashion industry and how even though I don't think that consumers need clothes to be any cheaper at this point, they still
Yeah.
keep creating cheaper clothes and creating more pollution as a result of just like cheap fabrics and the cost. And so it makes me think about it's like they would have to kind of come to a compromise where they're like, we can still try to create goods as cheaply as possible, but not to the insane extent that they do, where it's basically just to create wealth for these executives and stuff. Because, like, I don't think like with certain companies, it's like these things don't need to be cheaper. They're just cheaper because private businesses can gain from it.
Excellent. Yeah, I think fast fashion is a fantastic example. It's nothing he would have really known about. It's something that's come about in the last 20 years, thanks to globalization. By the way, I just remembered a point that I wanted to make earlier. One of the big things holding down inflation, globalization. Now that your clothes can be made in Bangladesh, prices are going to be down. Okay. All right. Listen, everybody, I'm going to let you all go because it's time. I didn't get to talk to, there was one other thing that was really, really important I wanted to talk to, especially I was thinking about it when Daniel was talking about how, you guys, talking about companies and sustainability, blah, blah. We got to talk about this article that Milton Friedman wrote called "The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profits," where he's very critical about, he essentially argues that companies should not try to have a social consciousness at all, right? A really devilish stance. But wait till you see his argument. It's actually a little bit ingenious, but it's also been incredibly powerful and influential in ways that we need to take up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to also post it for your reading for next week. It's short. It's 6 pages from the New York Times in 1970. The article by Ta-Nehisi Coates is from the Atlantic. It reads very easily. So I think you can definitely tackle them both for next week. And they're both good reads. So I'm going to open class next week by talking about that article by Friedman, which will allow us to just finish up a couple major points by him. And then we'll get into Ta-Nehisi Coates. Okay. All right. I'm going to let you all go. Have a wonderful week. And I'll stick around if anybody needs to talk to me. Okay. All right. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Good week.
Later.
Thank you.
Hello. Teresa? Did you want to talk to me?